So, Juan Cole is a distinguished historian and public intellectual. He's the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. Um, he was a pioneering blogger on the Middle East since the early 2000s, which is basically the beginning of blogging. Um, and he had and still has the assertively and appropriately named informed comment that I first came across in 2003 or 2004, I think. Um, and of course, Juan, you've written many books and translations on a huge range of topics related to the Middle East and the world of Islam. So your works include Muhammad, the Prophet of Peace amid the clash of empires, 2020, engaging the Muslim world, 2009, and among your historical works, modern history, Napoleon's Egypt invading the Middle East, 2007. It's been a bit of an invading the Middle East that's been happening. So welcome to this is the first Tamuda English video podcast that we're doing. I can't think of a better person who to be doing it with. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Thank you very much, Martin.
I
Ahlan
was I
bik.
was hoping to hear some Arabic. I would trigger you're a
Well, I
fluent
said
Arabic.
ahlan bik. Yeah.
Ahlan bik. Ahlan. Yeah, sorry, I interrupted, which may happen. I'll try not to do that. But how are you doing today?
Well, it's a lovely day in the Midwest from every point of view, except the advent of a new regime in the United States that has some pretty horrific edges to it.
I wanted to start. You've got such a wide range of scholarship, so I wanted to reflect that a little bit in how we approach things before we dive completely into modern politics. So we will spend a little bit of time talking about history. Uh, so can we start just with the decades, the years leading up to the First World War? Um, can you help us understand what kind of place the Arab world was then from a historical perspective? And leading on from that, can you account for the huge, massive changes that happened after the First World War and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, imposed from outside to a great extent? Can you give our audience your perspective on that?
Sure. Well, I'll push back a little bit against the idea of an Arab world. The Arab nationalists will be peeved at me, but at the say we take 1900, uh, most of what we now refer to as the Arab world, the Arabic-speaking areas of the Middle East, were under the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, or the French Empire. And so there was no political or, I would argue, even necessarily conscious unity among Arabic speakers. Just as there are lots of, Tajikistan speaks Persian, but it's not politically identified with Iran in any way. The ones that were under the Ottoman Empire were the Levantine states or provinces. I mean to say, there was a arrangement for the Christians in what is now Lebanon as part of Ottoman Syria. There were various administrative units. We don't need to go into the equivalent of our, I suppose, counties and provinces and states, but all ruled from Istanbul.
So when you say you can't call it the Arab world, but geographically there is an Arabosphere that existed, but you're saying that it didn't feel as though it was any kind of unity.
It didn't cohere in any obvious way. It didn't trade with itself. It traded north to Europe. Its political priorities were set in distant capitals, Istanbul, London, and Paris. And mm, because of still low literacy, uh, I think most Syrians probably couldn't have had a conversation with most Moroccans. The language, modern standard Arabic, hadn't been promulgated. So it, We historians are very suspicious of national narratives, and Eric Hobsbawm, the great historian, pointed out that in 1800, the Sicilians and the Venetians were not Italians together, and they didn't couldn't understand each other, and weren't part of the same polity and so forth. And I think that Italy before the unification in the late 19th century is an interesting way to think about the Middle East before the modern period.
Mm. Well, I didn't mean to make a national narrative. That was unintentional. Um, is that well? So how did the Arab world then take shape as an Arab world? And also, if you could take that, but also if you could take the question, is that why it was so susceptible for these changes from the outside that did come in the aftermath of the First World War?
Well, what happened in the First World War was that the Ottoman Empire made a very substantial error in joining Austria and Germany, the losing side. And it might not have mattered so much, but the war in Europe was so horrible and so many lives lost. You know, a single battle could result in 800,000 casualties at that time. That the European powers were shaky and were afraid of their own publics because of this. Frankly, it was a public relations disaster. The lack of progress in the war in Europe in the first 2 years, and so they decided, in order to get some victorious headlines, that they would attack the third party, the Ottoman Empire, because that presumably was something that they could pull off much more easily than they could defeating Germany. And so the British invaded Iraq from India, from British India, but their initial invasion underestimated the Ottomans, who had good advice from German generals and had recently bought a lot of good German arms and fought them off. And so they had to invade again the succeeding year. And this time they actually took the Mesopotamian Valley. Or they took Mesopotamia. This was how we get the country of Iraq. It is what the British Indian troops were able to conquer in the course of World War I. Doesn't cohere in very many other ways. And likewise, Churchill had the bright idea of trying to land near to Istanbul and just march on the capital, because you take the enemy's capital, you win the war. And so he had the New Zealanders and Australians attempt to take the Isthmus of Gallipoli. That didn't work out. That was a huge failure and a costly one. But in the end, the Ottomans were defeated, partially, as you suggest, I think, implicitly, because the Arabic-speaking peoples of the Ottoman Empire turned against them and began yearning for an Arab state that was not under Istanbul's rule. And this was spearheaded by fairly remote provinces like the Hijaz, the Western Arabia, where the Ottomans had built a railroad and become more assertive and had annoyed local elites. And so they allied with the British and marched on Damascus ultimately and chased the Ottomans right out of what is now Syria. And in the aftermath, the Arabs, however, were stabbed in the back by the victorious powers, France and Britain, because the British Arab Bureau in Cairo very clearly promised Sharif Hussein in Mecca an Arab state after the war, which would include Syria. But London promised Syria to the French. And then there were British interests who wanted Iraq and particularly Mosul, which had oil. So, um, which ultimately had oil. It was developed in the late 20s. In any case, the imperial powers double booked. You know how in an airline sometimes the company will sell your seat to somebody else as well. They double booked Syria, and then they didn't allow what is now Iraq to develop as an independent country. They colonized it themselves, and then very significantly, the British took uh, what they named Palestine, and they, during the war, had made a promise to the Jewish Zionists in London that they would make a something they called a national home in Palestine, uh, assuring the locals that this would not in any way inconvenience the people of Palestine.
The
Uh,
Balfour Declaration,
yes.
famously.
So the Balfour Declaration of 1917. So, and this was made at a time when the British didn't control Palestine yet. Um, but in any case, after the war, um, you saw an enormous mm, dejection in the Arab capitals, in the Arabic-speaking provinces of the former Ottoman Empire, Damascus, Baghdad, um, Jerusalem, uh, Beirut, that they hadn't achieved true independence. And they had been led to believe that President Wilson's 14 points and the idea of national sovereignty, the end of the old empires, which happened with regard to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So you get Hungary and Czechoslovakia and so forth, and Austria. But that did not happen in the Middle East. And the Middle East entered a new phase of colonialism, which, since it was under the League of Nations, was termed mandates, and it was an extremely paternalistic regime. I think the discourse was generally that people in the Middle East, unlike Czechs and Hungarians, were not quite ready to rule themselves. They were adolescents. They needed to award. They were wards of a guardian, and they needed to be grown up to the point where they could stand on their own feet. This was the kind of discourse that was used. It reemerged during the Iraq War. George W. Bush once said that the Iraqis were about ready to take off the training wheels. So he imagined them as small children who couldn't quite ride a bike yet, and he was going to help them mature to that point.
Yeah.
So this betrayal of the aspirations of many intellectuals in the region um, was very significant because many had hopes for liberal democracy and of a Wilsonian sort, and they increasingly felt that the entire prospect was a chimera and that they might as well turn inward. And so you get the beginnings of hardline Muslim fundamentalism, the Muslim Brotherhood. You get people later on in the 40s turning to interest in the mass movements in Central Europe, mixing together fascist and communist themes with Arab nationalism. And so you get the Ba'ath Party, which became consequential for Syria and Iraq. These were all, I would argue, reactions against the mandate scam, in which people were not given their independence after World War One and were subjected to a form of colonialism.
Mm. How it seems extraordinary, an extraordinary series of events to have kicked off from an embarrassment about failure in Europe and how that then just set off these, I won't call them dominoes falling, these. I mean, I guess history is like that, right? I'm not I'm not a historian, but is it how how unusual do you think was that duplicitousness of the British, that double deal, the double booking, with this disrespect for the local population, their ability to just treat them as so many children, as you say. Um, is was that par for the course, or can the Middle East in 100 years later look back and think, wow, we were particularly badly treated?
Oh no, and I don't think it has anything to do with again with the British or the French. When you're at war, you're desperate to win, and the consequences of defeat are dire,
Hmm.
and so you pull all kinds of operations, covert and otherwise. If it wins the war to tell the Syrians that they'll be independent, then you tell them that,
Yeah.
and it may be an inconvenient position after the war when things look different and you've won. So I think it's structural. It has to do with the way that empires work. It is also undeniable that some imperial officials in London and Paris uh, did not see locals as proper human beings, as full
Mhm. Yeah.
political partners. And But it wasn't a universal sentiment. You find it in Curzon, for instance. Actually, Churchill, I think, had a lot of respect for, say, the Ottoman Muslims, and in France, there was a big debate about whether Algerians were capable of being civilized or not. And so the ones who believed that they were had what was called a civilizational mission, a mission civilisatrice. And so, I think there was a superciliousness involved in those deals that were made. And there's an anecdote about one of the things that came out of that maelstrom of World War I was the creation of the country of Jordan, and was the part of originally the territory that the British conquered and thought of as British Palestine, but they hived it off across the Jordan River and gave it to Abdullah, the son of Sharif Hussein. It was kind of a booby prize because Abdullah was supposed to be part of a dynasty that ruled the whole Arab world, but he only got this postage stamp country and of what became Jordan. But years later, when Churchill was prime minister, uh, Jordan objected to some policy that Churchill had adopted, and their diplomatic mission in London sent over a sharp note to him. And he was having lunch with friends, and he looked at this note from Jordan objecting to his policies, and he smiled broadly and told his luncheon companions, "We made it up on the back of an envelope over an afternoon."
Hmm.
You couldn't take
Wow.
Jordan seriously as a
Yeah.
country.
Yeah. Not if it's the back of an envelope country. Wow. Gosh. The seeds of conflict today. Then, how many straight lines can you draw from these topics that you've been talking about briefly? How many can we link now to the various disasters that we see in the region?
Well, they're intimately linked because I would argue that European imperialism in the 20th century uh, set the terms of debate, and the Europeans had not taken the Levant in the 19th century, in part because the Ottomans allowed free transit to
Hmm.
the British and French empires, and were thought of in Europe as perfectly reliable in that regard. In fact, the Europeans much preferred a continued Ottoman Empire to Russian expansionism. They didn't trust the czars to let them get to India through the Suez Canal and so forth. Um, but they and then the Middle East wasn't seen as a big source of wealth. It's an arid zone. Aside from the river valleys like Egypt, where cotton began being grown, and which the British did take for 40 years. Much of the Middle East was arid, wasn't rich. We have to think that in the agrarian era, uh, India, what is now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, was rich because it had lots of rainfall and it could produce lots of crops, and crops were the source of wealth. The Middle East was dry, it was arid, and a third of its population in 1850 was probably pastoral nomads who were wandering around raising sheep and goats and camels and didn't have firm boundaries to their property. So why would you want to bother yourself about taking these places if you're an empire? It's not like they had gold, so they were left alone and under Ottoman rule until World War I, when the logic of the war dictated that it was now desirable for the Europeans to rule these places.
Mm. So tell us about the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood in there might have been a sort of unexpected or maybe an expected result of or outcome of that foreign interference. How did it emerge and how did it develop?
Well, it was founded in 1928 in Ismailia, which is a port town. In the aftermath of the so-called independence of Egypt in 1922 from the British, veiled protectorate is what they called it.
Mm.
They didn't admit that they colonized Egypt. They said they were protecting it. But in that 40 years, administrative law was made in London or by London's viceroy in Cairo. Uh, um, and Lord Cromer, Evelyn Baring from the banking family, was a long ruling viceroy in Egypt. Um, and uh, Local customs, local Islamic law, all of these things were set aside in favor of bureaucratic efficiency from a British point of view. And so people's lives were shaped by British rule. Uh, and Port cities like Ismailia, with a lot of foreign sailors, were seedy. So this school teacher, Hassan al-Banna, founded a Muslim reform movement, which aimed at turning back the clock, at repealing all of the regulations and laws put in by the British. Uh, and so it had a nationalist element to it. But the nationalism was not Egyptian nationalism per se. It was Muslim nationalism, a kind of pan-Islam. And there was, you know, a yearning for a central Muslim figure. The Muslims had in the medieval period a caliphate, a pope-like institution, uh, which, however, was both temporal and religious initially. Over time, uh, it lost its temporal power, and uh, in the high medieval period, it lapsed. But the Ottomans occasionally, in flowery language, had referred to themselves as caliphs. They were sultans, they were secular monarchs, but their courtiers would flatter them with the title of caliph. And since they ruled Mecca and Medina, the two holy cities, Mecca is the site of pilgrimage for the Muslim world, they had some Muslim aura to them. But most Ottoman law was made by the sultans through uh, imperial decrees and often differed from traditional Islamic law. But the Ottomans began pressing this claim to be caliphs, especially in the late 19th century, as a reaction against European encroachments.
Mm.
So the Europeans played a game of adopting Christian or other minorities in the Middle East as their proteges. So the French adopted the Catholics and the Maronites of Lebanon. Uh, the British were at a disadvantage because there weren't large numbers of Anglicans in the Middle East. So they adopted the Jews and a Shiite offshoot called the Druze. Um,
Mm.
when I was in Beirut, I noticed that to this day, the guard outside the British embassy was a Druze. It's an old tie. But the Europeans would call the Ottoman ambassador on the mat if there were a riot against minorities
Yeah.
and so forth. So the Ottomans turned the tables on the Europeans because the British had 300 million Indians under the rule, a quarter of whom were Muslim.
Hmm.
And the French, of course, ruled the Muslims of North Africa. The Russians had large Muslim populations in Central Asia under the Tsarist rule. So the Ottomans began claiming to be caliphs and began uh, propagandizing these Muslims who were living under European rule to make assertions of authority, which was effective. The British in India were petrified of a pan-Islam and of Ottoman influence in British India.
Mm.
The French in Algeria didn't like it at all either. And so this claim of being caliph became well known. And there was a whole caliphate movement in British India in the early 20th century, which pressed for greater rights for Muslims uh, and in the teens during World War I, it was how Mahatma Gandhi got involved in politics because he allied with these Muslim pro-caliphate forces who were anti-imperial in the nature of the case. So the Muslim Brotherhood, when after World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed and the Sultanate was abolished, and for good measure, then the new Turkish Parliament abolished the Caliphate in 1924, and declared secularism of a French sort as the ideological basis of the new Turkey, which dismayed conservative Muslims who had bought into the Ottoman claims of caliphal authority. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in the 1930s often urged the reestablishment of a caliphate. Um, and so there was this desire for an Islamic order. A Muslim law should be applied, and sort of modern colonial accoutrements should be thrown off. There was a kind of nationalism, but it was a religious nationalism. We have the equivalent in the contemporary United States with the Christian nationalists who don't believe in a separation of religion and state and would like to have the Bible be the Constitution. It's a very similar set of attitudes as you had with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right. So, and how did it develop? Was did it develop underground in because of its the subversive um feel for the authorities had towards it? And and I suppose that my question is how far did it get? And is it can we draw a line between that process that happened in the 20s that came from Ismailia to what we see today in different political Islamic movements, Islamist movements?
Brotherhood established a Gaza branch in 1936, which is the ultimate background of Hamas. Um, and uh, there were other fundamentalist movements besides the Muslim Brotherhood who hearkened back to an ideal Islamic
Okay.
society. And
So they were rivals rather
they,
than
they
coming from
there,
the
there was
same
something called
channel.
the Salafis, who it's a word that refers to the first generation of Muslims around the Prophet. So trying to be like them, trying to go back and reestablish the kinds of attitudes and polity of the first generation of Muslims.
Mm.
And ironically, initially the Salafis were relative liberals. Muhammad Abduh was one of the founders, corresponded with Tolstoy, learned French. was interested in European science. But over time, and again, especially after the colonization of the Levant and after World War One, some important Salafi thinkers turned very conservative. There came to be under the influence of the Saudi branch of Islam, which outsiders call Wahhabism, and which Saudis refer to as Unitarianism. But that branch began in the mid 18th century and was extremely puritanical, believed that the Muslims just weren't living up to Islamic values and had a very rigid definition of what those values were. And so the melding of the Wahhabi ideas with Salafi ones created the contemporary Salafi movement. Some Salafis are um, quietists politically, don't get involved. Others are violent. So you have what Western observers sometimes call the Salafi jihadis. HTS is from that in Syria,
Okay.
which just took over Syria, is from that Salafi stream.
Mm.
And in fact, uh, it was militarily allied with some Muslim Brotherhood groups in Syria, but it's not clear who will come out on top.
So Syria, let's stick with Syria. How viable is Syria as a post-colonial concept? Can I ask that question to you?
Well, I think all of these post-colonial states have some problems in as much as they weren't formed organically over time, and they didn't have the advantages of a long organic formation. You know, European states like France also were very diverse ethnically. You had Breton, you had Provençal, but the Bourbon monarchy gradually spread Bourbon French all throughout the country, especially in the 19th century. You had this a national school system developed, and over time, Eugen Weber has a book, Peasants into Frenchmen. They were gradually absorbed into France as citizens. Um, in This process is much foreshortened in a place like Syria. And in many ways, there hasn't been time to form a Syria in the same way. There continue to be ethnic and religious differences. Uh, 10% of the population is Kurdish, doesn't speak Arabic at home. Uh, uh, 14% of the population are Alawite Shiites, a kind of folk Shiism, to which the elite of the former Ba'ath regime belonged. You have Druze. Maybe 5% are still Christian. And then the Sunni Arabs differ greatly in their identities. You have urban people, you have rural people, you have Sufis, you have Salafis. Sufis are kind of mystical Muslims. If you think in Catholicism of uh, St. John of the Cross and that kind of mystical tradition, uh, versus Salafis who are kind of like radical Protestants. So these kinds of ideological and sectarian and ethnic uh, divisions are consequential in a country like Syria in particular. I think the genius of liberal democracy is that, assuming a good economy, uh, it has an ability to absorb various groups and make them feel as though they have a voice because they have elections and they can lobby for legislation. And it makes most liberal um, political regimes make it inadvisable for an elected official to be punitive towards a particular ethnic group because it's going to cost that person votes. But in Syria, you've never had uh, any substantial period of liberal democracy. There was an experiment right after World War II, but as you say, the military coups began and then went on. soon thereafter. So somebody's going to be on top if you have a more dictatorial system. And whoever is on top is going to be punitive towards others, is going to be nepotistic. That's one of the reasons the Ba'ath regime fell. The Sunni Syrians will complain to you endlessly that the good jobs went to the Alawites, and now there's going to be some revenge taken over all that. Um, so if uh, if the Salafis who've taken over Syria are smart, they'll go to a national assembly and they'll have elections. But they're saying they won't do that for 4 years. You rule by fiat for 4 years. When would you ever give it up? So the indication seems to be that this relatively hard line Muslim fundamentalist group that's taken over the country is going to try to impose its will on the nation. And almost no Syrians are Salafis, so they don't have strong grassroots. And there are daggers drawn already with the Alawites, with the Kurds, with the Druze. And the Christians are kind of watching nervously to see how they're treated. The urban people are worried about their values and life ways. Urban women don't want to be immured in the house and made to veil completely. So people question: is this a kind of Taliban sort of regime? And so far, the leaders of the HTS have been pressured, I think, by Turkey in particular, and perhaps Qatar as well, not to show to the world a Taliban-like radical face. And so they announced, for instance, that Christian women wouldn't have to veil. Um, well, okay, that's good for the Christian minority, but are they going to make the Muslim women veil? And all of these things are being looked at, and they're consequential because Syria was under very severe US and European sanctions, which are still there. The fall of the Ba'ath regime did not automatically remove the sanctions. And it's very clear that Europe and the United States will bargain with the new leadership in Damascus or on what grounds the sanctions will be removed. And so the German foreign minister went to Damascus, and I think she made it clear that treatment of women and minorities would have a lot to say about how Europe will respond to the request that these sanctions be removed. So I think Syria is a huge question mark. If it's handled badly, it could fall apart and go to civil war. Certainly, there could be a Kurdish Arab war. If it's and we saw this happen in Iraq in 2006 and 7 when the country essentially fell into a Sunni Shia a civil war under the nose of the Americans. But imagine with no foreign troops in the country how severe such a conflict could be in Syria. There could be massive reprisals against Alawites. So it depends on the wisdom of the new leadership as to whether they can form a state that can incorporate the vast majority of Syrians, or whether they will try to form a state that pleases themselves and their small circle, but which inevitably will cause conflict with large swathes of the population.
Do you worry that the Western powers, America and the European countries, don't really have Syria's best interest at heart, and they'd rather see it weak and divided than than strong and united?
Well, I think there's certainly that kind of thinking in some quarters. And uh, on the other hand, I think there's a big difference between the United States and Europe in this regard. I don't mean to be too cynical, but a lot of Middle East policy in Europe is driven by fear of immigration. So if Syria went to civil war and there was another round of civil war, because of course it had one in the teens, which produced large numbers of immigrants to Europe, maybe a million to or on that order to Germany alone, and 4 million to Turkey. Um, if Syria fell apart, there might be another such wave. And European countries are feeling these waves of immigration from the Middle East are destabilizing. There seems to be a lot of resentment against immigrants in Italy and elsewhere in some parts of Germany. And so it's impetus to the rise of the European right. Some of those characters are really scary.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the lenses through which Syria is viewed in Europe, is that it would be desirable for Syria to attain at least some kind of fragile stability so that you don't have a big outflow of the population to Europe.
Yeah.
For the United States, this is not so much a problem because, uh, especially the new Trump regime in the United States will simply not allow asylum seekers in. Um, and and for the United States, for Washington, I think one of the things they'll be looking at is treatment of minorities. There's a Christian nationalism in the Trump administration, so they'll be concerned about the Christians of Aleppo and so forth. Another concern will be what kind of relationship the new Syrian government will have with Israel. And I think there will be enormous pressure from Washington on Syria to recognize Israel, to join the Abraham Accords. And it's quite ironic that the HTS, which is this hardline Salafi movement, they were called jihadis, uh, uh, actually so far has attempted to avoid bad relations with Israel, even though Israel has invaded Syria and taken advantage of the fall of the regime, has destroyed much of the Syrian military materiel, has taken territory and has taken control of a dam such that it has estimated to have 40% of Syria's water, which is very serious in an arid zone like the Middle East. And despite all of these provocations, which any one of them would cause a war in ordinary times, the HTS leader, Ahmed Ashara, has signaled that he doesn't want problems on that front. So far, at least, he's taking a very soft line towards Israel. I don't know if this government is ideologically capable of recognizing Israel without being killed by their own people. But which happened to Anwar Sadat, it should be remembered. So uh, I think the U.S. pressures on Syria would be destabilizing, whereas the European pressures on Syria would aim at stabilizing.
Well, we have to hope. Um, Yeah, so let's get into Israel. That's like certainly they'll be looking at the situation in Syria with a lot more satisfaction than they're looking at the situation in Gaza. We had the ceasefire came into force yesterday. We're speaking on January the 20th. We're not going to be publishing immediately, but just to check the date there, the guns fell silent. The first hostages were and the first prisoners were released, and we are in at the beginning of a very shaky looking ceasefire. I'm not going to ask you whether you think it's going to hold or not, because I mean, who knows? Opinion is divided, and unless you'd like to stick your neck out on that one. But what are the big learnings from this war? I mean, it's clearly unprecedented in terms of the scale, the time that it took, the savagery of it, the death toll in terms of Israel and its wars with mainly the Palestinians. It's this it's a new level. What 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 have we learned? Where do we go from here?
I think that the Israeli war on Gaza is a turning point in modern history. After World War II, attempts were made to establish a set of institutions, the United Nations, the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention, and subsequent treaties and protocols, many of which were incorporated into national law through treaty signatures. And then in the late 1990s, there was an attempt to establish an international criminal court. The Rome Statute came into force in 2002 and has gained, I think, 124 signatories. An attempt to establish what has been called international humanitarian law, laws of war, laws of basic human rights, and to gradually attempt to give those laws some teeth, because up until the International Criminal Court was established in 2002 at The Hague, the leaders of the world could suffer reputational damage from violating international humanitarian law, but there was no prospect of legal action against them. So that's been a post-war movement of some significance aimed at attempting to make it much more difficult to repeat the atrocities of World War II, in which some 65 million people are thought to have perished. The post-war generation was shocked to their core by the sheer carnage and by the viciousness and lawlessness and brutality of many of the actions that were taken, including the Nazi genocide of the Jews and the Roma and gays and others. And so international humanitarian law was intended to outlaw aggressive warfare, taking territory by military means from a neighbor, and deliberately targeting the civilian population, which the Nazis did. They did it right at the beginning of the war against Warsaw. It's often forgotten that the Nazi Air Force destroyed Warsaw. Wasn't that the Allies were necessarily always better. You have the U.S. Nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but
I was going to say Bomber Harris of Britain, the
oh
strategic
yes, and Bomber Harris, who, by the way, got his start in Iraq. The British hold on Iraq was very fragile, and so they quickly decided that they couldn't hold it by infantry, and they started bombing Iraqi villages into submission. Bomber Harris was in charge of that campaign all through the 20s, and then he used what he had learned to firebomb Germany later on. So there's a colonial background to some of this. But in any case, I think the Gaza war raises the question of whether there's now a determination in the United States, in Washington, D.C., but also in the capitals of Europe, to destroy international humanitarian law, to undo it, to go back to 1939 by giving the Israelis impunity.
Where will that leave them?
Well, I mean, the logic of it is apparently that I believe it's irrational, but the United States and Europe are increasingly enthralled with white nationalism and with a kind of fascism. And fascism is all about humiliation. I mean, if you go back and look at the speeches of not just Hitler, but many leaders in the interwar period, they're all about being supine, being stepped upon, being humiliated by the outside world. The outside world is looking at us and laughing at us, and so forth. As the power of the United States and Europe has declined relatively, not absolutely, because they're still very powerful, but there are new players on the block. China is emerging. India is emerging in ways that I don't think most geopolitical analysts take into account. I mean, it's now a $3 trillion a year economy. It's a bigger economy than Britain's, ironically enough, even though, of course, per capita, there's no comparison. But if you just want to talk about the sheer concentration of capital in a country, India is emerging as a very major player. And so it's a multipolar world. And it had for a long time been a bipolar world with the two superpowers after World War II. And then, since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, it's been a unipolar world in which the United States got its way. It could rampage around invading Iraq and Afghanistan, could face down Putin and the Chinese leadership, and make its word stick. And now the ability of the United States and Europe to dominate is in question, increasingly in question because of immigration. There's a new multiculturalism that's very unwelcome in white nationalist quarters, which then syncs with the anxieties about geopolitics. And so I think Israel is seen in many Western capitals as the bulwark against the barbarian hordes of the global South, which are tinged Muslim, even though that's unfair to the Muslims in so many ways, but that's the way it's configured. And that if you let Israel go under, then you have no shield. Then you're vulnerable to those hordes. And if it means destroying the edifice of international humanitarian law, or at least carving out this enormous black hole of an exception in which the Israelis are allowed to do things that Vladimir Putin is not allowed to do, uh, then I don't think it can stand. I mean, the hypocrisy is too severe. Nobody would take it seriously, and as it is, when the U.S. politicians or ambassadors go and address countries in the third world and talk about the importance of upholding international law, I mean, they're greeted with hilarity because what the Israelis did to Gaza was illegal every which way from Sunday or Saturday, as the
Mm.
case may be.
Yeah.
And so
Those,
and I think
those extraordinary scenes in the briefing room at the State Department, with Anthony Blinken's last press statement. It's unprecedented, isn't it?
yes, well, Sam Husseini, the journalist, asked him when he would be tried at The Hague, and was hauled out. Uh, Actually, wasn't any grounds to haul him out of the room. It was there's a deterioration of the norms of democratic society here, and it's not a partisan deterioration. It happens among many parties, and so. Yeah, I think it may be a mortal wound to the post-war edifice. And one of the reasons that countries typically in warfare didn't violate the Geneva Conventions about the treatment of prisoners of war, the treatment of occupied populations, was that it was mutual. They wouldn't want their people to be treated that way. And so destroying it is always a self-inflicted wound.
Mm.
But I think that's what's happening for all of these reasons. And I think the Israelis are being given impunity because they're seen as a symbol of the last stand of white nationalism. Ironically enough, because the white nationalists viciously discriminated against Jews for most of the 20th century and indeed genocided them. So
Yeah.
why they're picking that symbol, I couldn't tell you. But and so this is
Well, it's something to do with Islam, isn't it? It's and that point that you made that they're a bastion against it. But yeah,
yeah. Well, I mean that's the way it's being configured. But all of these things are irrational. Most of the people who live in the global South are not Muslim,
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
and there are lots of anti-imperial Christians
Mm.
in Africa and elsewhere. So I think Islam is being deployed in a particular kind of way as a symbol of global South resistance to continued dominance of white nationalism. Um, and our new Secretary of Defense in the United States wrote a book which has the word crusade in the title and which is all about the need to fight Islam. It's quite frightening that people like that are being put in high office in the West.
Mm.
And it's not only in the United States that people talk like that.
So
Uh, yeah.
that element of mutuality, of mutual sort of observing the treaties in order to be treated like that, is Israel sowing the seeds of its own destruction in doing this, do you think?
I mean, I think it's not just sowing the seeds of its own destruction, but it's undermining one of the edifices that upheld its existence. Uh, it's a member of the United Nations, and it makes a lot of claims on its national rights as a member of the United Nations. But if being a if the UN Charter is a dead letter, then what good would it do Israel to be a member of the United Nations? And there are even, the UN General Assembly is speaking about expelling Israel from the
Yeah.
United Nations. So
But
the other thing, though,
what you're saying is that it's a lot bigger than just Israel. The fate of just Israel.
enormously, enormously, it has to do with the entire legal structure of our lives as global citizens. And the Gaza war has much diminished us all.
Yeah.
Uh, the other thing to say, though, is that it's been highly successful. Uh, the United States has built Israel and Europe up into the a kind of regional superpower with the ability to bomb everybody in the region. It can reach Iran. Now that especially that Syria has fallen, there are no anti-aircraft batteries in Syria to stop Israel from violating Syrian airspace to get at Iran.
Mm.
Uh, and Iraq is weak. The Israelis have been bombing Yemen, including lots of facilities that damage the lives of civilians. And the Yemenis have been firing ballistic missiles at Israel. But uh, Iran has been revealed to be a paper tiger. It is much diminished. It couldn't defend itself from the Israeli Air Force or Israeli missiles. The Hezbollah suffered a dramatic defeat, not a total defeat, but a dramatic defeat. The Iraqi Shia militias are non-entities. And so Iran's fabled axis of resistance showed itself when push came to shove, they were irrelevant. They were minor irritants. They were mosquitoes.
How successful was the Yemeni, the Ansar Allah effort to
You
counter
know, again, I
the
think they're just
Palestinians?
minor irritants. They did hit Israel several times and sometimes caused damage or wounded people. They interfered with the functioning of Eilat, Israel's port on the Red Sea. They interfered with shipping through the Red Sea and probably added some cost to international trade. Some percentage of inflation would be there. But it just is inconsequential. It's not, it had no effect, but it didn't have a dramatic effect. It didn't have the desired effect of
Mm.
making the Israelis more cautious. And the Israelis were able simply to destroy Gaza. To
Yeah,
Now, I'm going to say this:
yeah, go on.
they targeted civilians.
It's clear.
Their self-analysis, their own story about themselves, is that they were trying to get at Al-Qassam brigades, Hamas militants, and the civilians got in the way, and that's why there's so many dead. But this is simply not true. They targeted the civilians.
Mm.
The United Nations did a report that looked at the dropping of 2,000-pound bombs. I mean, these are enormous bombs on civilian residential complexes. Now, it's true, they were trying to kill Al Qassam brigades people who were in those complexes, but they were full of women and children, and non-combatant men, it should be remembered.
Yeah.
And to deliberately destroy a residential complex with hundreds of people in it, uh, uh, and to kill. I mean, it's estimated that the true death toll of the kinetic of the military actions is probably a good 70,000 once you get all the people out from under the rubble. And then they destroyed this civilian infrastructure of water, food, medicine. Uh, the Lancet estimated that already it's baked in that over time, some 300,000 people would die of this thing. I mean, to have what since the end of World War II, uh, what liberal democracy has behaved in this way? Um, Maybe the United States and Vietnam, but the sheer, I mean, if you think about 2.2 million people in Gaza, um, 8 or 9 million in Israel, if you just projected that on the world stage, you compared it to the size of the United States and Vietnam, Gaza is much worse. Uh, and uh, and it was done with impunity before the world's eyes. We kept asking the State Department, "Aren't you going to ask the Israelis about this?" They said, "No, we'll let them investigate themselves." I mean, if you watched Matthew Miller and the State Department briefings, they were after a while they were darkly comical, and very discouraging. And the same thing was true of the German Foreign Ministry, of the UK, and so the Israelis seem to be getting away with this,
Mm.
and they have now become, uh, I would say, hegemonic in the Middle East. There's no other power that can stand up to them, and they can do as they please. They can take parts of Syria. They can take over Syria's water. They can destroy all the buildings in Gaza. They can inflict hundreds of thousands of casualties on people with impunity, and the West is all right with it.
Yeah. As an historian, how do you look at this? How long can this go on for? How does it end?
Well, as a historian, I would say that the advantages of the Israelis are short term, medium term at best. Um, will will all the people in the Middle East forever have worse technology than the United States and Israel? Uh, how how long is it before they reverse engineer some of this drone technology or computer chip technology? They're already, very good at cyber espionage. And so it's a constant race for the Israelis to stay ahead. And the U.S. has been fairly successful in using economic sanctions to keep countries like Iran, which won't play ball, which are on the wrong side, uh, much more economically weak than they otherwise would be. But that's pushed Iran into China's arms. And if China continues to grow economically and Iran is under that penumbra, then Iran may benefit from Chinese efflorescence. The Iranians and the Russians now have a much stronger alliance than in the past. So, the Israelis are on the top of their game, but can they stay there? It's a constant race. The other problem is that Israel itself is unstable. The only way that Benjamin Netanyahu could come back to power in 2022 was to let into his cabinet the Israeli equivalents of neo-Nazis, um, people to the far, far, far right,
Mm.
people that would never be allowed in any government in Western Europe, and people of that sort. ideologically. Uh, People who want to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and who were behind what was done to the Palestinians of Gaza. And who every time that Netanyahu, who's, for all of his faults and his own right-wing ideology, has in the past proved himself occasionally to be capable of some pragmatism, he didn't want his government to fall. And these far-right elements kept promising to or threatening to withdraw from his government if he stopped the war. So they kept it going, and it was deliberate on their part. They wanted to starve people. They said so, and they took steps to do so. Well, they're not good for Israel proper. They want to make women sit on the back at the back of the bus. They want to institute a kind of Jewish Talibanism in Israel. They accuse gay people of bestiality, and they want to give privileges to the Israeli squatters on the Palestinian West Bank uh, that annoy Israelis inside Israel, which divert resources to them, and so forth. So before the Gaza war, there were increasing tensions inside Israeli society, large demonstrations against this far right-wing government, the most far right-wing government that Israel has ever had. And that internal division was going towards not a civil war, but it wouldn't be fought with arms, but it was going towards a very deep division in Israeli society. And there's some question about whether Israeli Jews want to live in a Taliban-like Jewish state, and whether they might not just leave. Israelis don't have to live in Israel. They're mostly well-educated. They have good skills. There's about a million Israelis outside the country at any one time. People go off in their late 20s and stay abroad for a couple decades and then come back. There's some evidence that they're not coming back at the same rate. And there's also evidence of tens of thousands of young Jews engaged in outmigration. And some of this is the war, but the war hasn't touched the average Israeli all that much. A lot of it is the threat of the far right taking over the country. So that's another question, is not obviously the Israelis can defeat all of their enemies in the region fairly handily, apparently. Whether that will be true 50 years from now, I cannot tell you. But the other question is whether Israeli society itself can keep it together.
So, Juan, I first came across you as the man with the brainchild called Informed Comment, which was it was a pioneering blog. There weren't many people around who were writing about the Middle East with such authority and such, with the historians, the scholars' perspective. What made you start it up? How have you kept it going, and what do you feel the impact has been?
Well, I began it as a direct result of the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the United States by Al Qaeda. I had lived a lot in the Middle East, unlike a lot of U.S. Middle East experts who maybe have a 1 year Fulbright and then build their career on that. I lived out there for many years, and I lived in Egypt when we saw the rise of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. I lived in Pakistan at the time when uh, the um, the predecessors of Al Qaeda were gathering there to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviets. So when 9/11
You were
happened,
in Beirut in 1975, right?
I was
Yeah,
in 74 through 79, off and on, a
yeah,
couple of years in Egypt in that period. So
yeah.
the
Crucial times.
when 9/11 happened, I had a context for it. I had been following Al Qaeda, actually. I used to give a lecture on it at the end of my Middle East class every year. And people didn't know about Al Qaeda after 9/11. The whole country's focus was on who are these people? Why did they do this to us? And I knew. I could tell them, and I didn't even have to look it up. I could just tell them. And so initially, at that time, the major form of communication was the email round robin or listserv. And I was on some scholarly ones, and people would ask me my opinion about things and Al Qaeda, and I would answer on email, and then these emails, which were little essays, got spread around. People would forward them to their friends, and I would get fan mail from Denmark. And I liked your message of November 20th. And people would start asking me for back issues. I heard you wrote something very interesting on such and such date. Could you please send it to me? And at the time, we were using Outlook for email, and it wasn't actually convenient to go back and find a message and send it back out. So it occurred to me as blogging arose that I could just archive the messages, which I thought of as public, at a website as a blog, and then I could just direct people to it would give it a universal resource locator. I could just direct the people to the URL instead of having to search back in my email archives. And that was how it started. If you look at the first few entries in 2002, they're emails. They're reprinted emails. And
Yeah.
then over time, I started making original entries at the blog. And I would, the internet had spread to the Arab world, and so I was able to see Arabic newspapers in real time. And and I could do keyword searches, so I could find things about Al Qaeda, and I was reporting back to the American public about this issue. But then Bush invaded Iraq, and I had written about Iraq in my dissertation. I was one of the few Americans who had written some Iraqi history. And again, I knew about especially the Shiites of Iraq and their history, and those became very consequential to the story. And so people asked me to write things, and the blog went viral at that point. I went from having, maybe 1,000 visitors a day to some days 40,000. And if you calculate that out over a year, it's millions. I'd never had a million of anything. So
I would love to know what it looks like after 23 years, 24 years,
well,
20.
it goes up and down depending on the crises
Yeah.
that are in the region.
I
I
mean,
would,
it's a
yeah.
crowded market now.
It's a crowded market. The algorithms are also bad for the blog because Facebook deprecates news. X doesn't like links outside the platform. And so traffic is down because of these algorithmic kinds of censorship. Palestine is deprecated on a lot of the algorithms. But I think people still copy it and send it out by email, which nobody can do anything about. You can't censor that. And
Yeah.
so I sense it's still very widely read in that form,
Mm.
in email newsletters. And, every city has these little peace groups and things that they'll reprint my work for their members. So I think it has an impact. I know back in 2009, when the Obama administration was coming in, my book, Engaging the Muslim World, uh, was allegedly widely read among State Department people as kind of a primer for people coming into the new administration and how to avoid the mistakes of the Bush administration. So at some points, I think it's gotten the ear of some people with some foreign policy power. But I don't do it for that reason. I'm a Democrat with a small d. I feel that in a democracy, foreign policy is often the thing that is forwarded to the central government, to the federal government, and that's a mistake. It creates a foreign policy dictatorship, that everybody should be involved in the foreign policy decisions of the country. And that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
Right. Well, I view it as the original and best. So it deserves our respect and admiration. Well,
Well, thank you so much.
thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure talking to you and hearing your ideas. And we've covered a pretty good range of topics. And thanks for staying with us so long.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Martin. All the
Okay.
best.